Hello, and welcome back to Accidental Transcendental. I'm Paul. I want to start the show today with a phrase that gets thrown around a lot these days. Just be yourself. Lovely. Great advice. Stick it on a mug. The only problem is that for many people, the relationship with themselves is a little complicated. Because which self are we talking about? The one who wants adventure or the one who wants to stay at home? The one who wants to start another project, or the one who would quite like a nap? The one who wants to speak up, or the one who would rather avoid the awkward conversation entirely? Most of us are less like a single unified person and more like a mildly dysfunctional committee sharing a group chat. Different priorities, different hopes and fears, different needs, different ideas about what should happen next. And occasionally, somebody says something so ridiculous that everyone else spends 3 days arguing about internally. For a long time, I thought that was just how life worked. You grow up, you learn the rules, you find your place, you become who you're supposed to be. And if parts of you don't quite fit, well, you sand those bits down, you adapt, you compromise, you become manageable, which works. Until it doesn't. Because sometimes the things we build to help us survive become the very things that stop us growing. And that's what this episode is really about. Not trauma, not neurodivergence, not chronic illness, not even authenticity. Although all of those things appear along the way. This is a story about boxes. The shapes we build around ourselves. The shapes other people build around us, the shapes we inherit, the shapes we defend, and what happens when those shapes become too small to contain a living person. Because this feels important to say early. Sometimes the box helps. Sometimes it gets us through school, through family systems, workplaces, and relationships, through rooms we don't yet know how to survive as ourselves. Sometimes the box is not built by someone who hates you. Sometimes it is built by a younger version of yourself who was just trying to get through the day. And I think that deserves compassion. Looking back now, I don't think my life changed when I discovered some hidden truth about myself. I think my life changed when different parts of me slowly stopped pulling in different directions. When there was less friction, less resistance, less internal civil war, and more of me moving in the same direction. Not perfectly, not all the time, and certainly not before coffee. But enough. Enough that life started feeling less like being dragged behind my own experience, and more like participating in it. So this isn't a story about becoming someone new. It's a story about making room for somebody who was already there. And like most good stories, it starts much earlier than I realized. Back when I was a kid. Back when the box didn't exist yet. Or at least before I knew I was building one. So before I talk about the box, I think it's important to talk about what came before it. Because when people tell stories like this, there's often the temptation to start with the wound, the rupture, the thing that went wrong, the moment everything changed. I don't think that's where my story begins. And maybe that's not where yours begins either. Because before the adaptations, before the masks, before the survival strategies, there was just a child. And I think I was a happy child, a curious child, a loving child, a child who was excited by the world, a child who wanted to understand how things worked, who collected shiny things and facts with roughly the same level of enthusiasm. I love patterns, rules, systems, the feeling of something clicking into place. Apparently, I learned all my times tables when I was about 3 years old, which sounds impressive now, but I suspect at the time it was less tiny genius and more small child discovers socially acceptable repetitive behaviour. I loved the certainty of it, the rhythm, the structure, the way the numbers behaved if you learned how to meet them on their own terms. I remember being fascinated by computers too. Our first computer was a second-hand Commodore VIC-20, which for younger viewers was basically a beige magic brick from the ancient world. And I remember writing little basic programs on it when I was 6 or 7. Nothing that was about to revolutionize technology. Nothing that would worry Silicon Valley, but enough to feel that strange thrill of pressing a key and watching the machine respond. Cause and effect. Input and output. Order emerging from symbols. That made sense to me. But even then, there were clues. Little hints of the shape that would only make sense decades later. I loved new ideas, but I didn't always love new situations. I loved understanding things, but I didn't always love uncertainty. I loved exploration, as long as I could carry enough familiarity with me. Busy rooms could overwhelm me. Unexpected changes could overwhelm me. New environments could overwhelm me. And I didn't have the language for that. I just knew that some things seemed to cost me more than they cost other people. One of my earliest memories is actually a story about hiding, or at least partially hiding. When I was at play school, I struggled when I was dropped off. Rather than enthusiastically joining in, I apparently spent a lot of time under the tables. Which, if we're being honest, still sounds like a reasonable strategy in certain social situations. But what matters isn't that I hid, it's what happened next. There was a woman there called Chris, and she didn't force me out. She didn't tell me to stop being silly. She didn't explain why I should be fine. She just came and sat with me, right there, under the table. And looking back now, I think that's one of the earliest experiences of safety that I can remember. Not being fixed, not being persuaded, not being corrected, just being met where I was. Someone willing to enter my world before asking me to enter theirs. Someone willing to wait until I was ready. That image has stayed with me. And I think it matters, because in many ways, the rest of this episode is about that same idea. What actually helps people unfold? What allows them to grow? What lets them become more of themselves? In my experience, it is rarely force, rarely pressure, rarely shame. It's safety, not comfort, safety. There is a difference. And for a while, I had enough of it. Not perfectly. No childhood is perfect. But enough. Enough structure, enough familiarity, enough love. Especially from my dad, whose love for me always felt visible, obvious, like I mattered. The world felt coherent, predictable, held together by routines I trusted. The shape made sense. I knew where things were. I knew where people were. I knew where I was. And then, when I was 8 or 9 years old, the floor disappeared. Not literally, obviously. I would have mentioned that sooner. My parents divorced. And before I go any further, I want to say something important. This isn't a blame story. It's not a trial. It's not an attempt to go back through the past, assigning villains and victims. Adults are complicated. Relationships are complicated. Families are complicated. And most people are doing the best they can with the understanding they have at the time. But from inside the experience of a child, especially a child who relied heavily on structure, routine, familiarity, and predictability, it felt like the world I'd learned how to live in vanished almost overnight. The routines changed, the assumptions changed, the geography changed, the shape changed. Everything that had quietly held my world together suddenly moved. And I didn't have the language to explain why that affected me so deeply. I only knew it did. Looking back now, the closest analogy I can find is probably a hard drive failure. One moment, everything is where you left it. Pictures, documents, games, memories. The familiar folders you've navigated 1,000 times. And then, suddenly, None of it opens. You know the world still exists, but the map is gone. And for me, that was the hardest part. Not simply losing the old structure, but losing confidence in the structure itself. And perhaps the biggest loss of all was my dad. Not losing him entirely, he was still there, still loved me, still supported me, still one of the most important people in my life. But I no longer had the same access to him, the same daily closeness, the same sense of him being woven into the ordinary rhythm of life. And that mattered, because he felt like safety to me. He felt like certainty, like someone whose love wasn't conditional on me performing correctly, someone whose support was visible. And I don't remember feeling that I had much choice in any of it. I remember the change happening. I remember adapting. I remember carrying on. But I mostly remember confusion, deep loneliness, a feeling that I was on my own in a world that constantly felt too big, too much, too unsafe, not kind enough, not patient enough, not loving enough. So yeah, somehow I carried on, mostly washed along with the current of each day. Because children are remarkably resilient, they're also remarkably adaptive. And those are not always the same thing. Sometimes resilience means remaining yourself through difficulty. Sometimes adaptation means becoming someone slightly different in order to survive. I think what happened next was much closer to adaptation. I didn't consciously decide to change. I didn't sit down and create a new personality. I didn't wake up one morning and think, right, time to become a more socially acceptable version of Paul. But I did begin paying closer attention to what worked and what didn't, to what created connection and what created friction, to what brought warmth and what brought distance. Because when the external structure disappears, the nervous system starts looking for new ways to create safety. And sometimes, without even realizing it, we begin building the box. Not because we're weak, not because we're dishonest, not because we're doing anything wrong, but because some part of us is trying to answer a very human question. How do I stay connected in a world that no longer feels certain? And I think that's where my box really began. Not as a prison, not as a mistake, but as a survival strategy. A shape built by a child trying to find his footing after the floor had disappeared. I don't think most people decide to abandon parts of themselves. At least not consciously. I certainly didn't. I wasn't sitting there at 9 years old with a strategic development plan. I wasn't running a quarterly review on my personality. I wasn't creating a PowerPoint presentation called Paul 2.0, now with improved social acceptability. It happened much more quietly than that. The way most adaptation happens. You pay attention, you watch, you learn. You notice what gets rewarded. You notice what gets praised and what gets ignored. You notice what makes people smile and what makes people uncomfortable. You notice which parts of you seem welcome and which parts seem to create friction. And over time, you begin making adjustments. Tiny ones at first, almost invisible. A little less of this, a little more of that. A slightly different response, a slightly different mask, a slightly different version of yourself, depending on the room. Because connection matters, especially when we're young. Belonging matters. Safety matters. And if you're not careful, you can start confusing those things with approval. You start believing that being loved and being acceptable are the same thing. That being yourself and being accepted are somehow competing objectives. So I learned. I learned what was expected and what was accepted. I learned what was loved and what wasn't. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it. The world teaches these lessons indirectly, through 1,000 tiny interactions, 1,000 tiny signals. 1,000 tiny moments of warmth and distance. And I got quite good at reading those signals, or at least trying to, sometimes successfully, sometimes spectacularly unsuccessfully. Because here's the funny thing. For someone who spent a lot of time studying people, I didn't always understand them particularly well. I trusted people I shouldn't have trusted, missed signs I should have seen, walked into situations carrying a completely different understanding of what was happening than everyone else in the room, which, looking back, explains a lot. But the important thing isn't that I got things wrong. The important thing is what happened next. Because every understanding, every awkward moment, every painful lesson added another voice to the committee. One voice started saying, "Be careful." Another said, "Don't stand out." Another said, "Keep the peace." Make sure everyone likes you. Don't be too much. And eventually, I found myself being pulled in multiple directions at once. One part wanted honesty, another wanted belonging, another wanted safety, freedom, rest, approval. And the friction between them was at times enormous. Although I wouldn't have described it in that way at the time. At the time, it just felt like anxiety, or overthinking, or indecision, or paralysis, or that strange experience of being unable to move because two equally convincing internal voices are arguing over what to do next. I suspect most people know that feeling. Being of two minds, or three, or seven. The strange thing is that each voice is usually trying to help. That's what I've come to appreciate. Even the difficult ones, even the exhausting ones, even the ones that seem determined to derail your entire afternoon. They're all trying to protect something. Connection, dignity, safety, acceptance, love. The problem is that protection and alignment are not the same thing. And if enough parts of you start pulling in different directions, you can spend years expending enormous amounts of energy without actually moving very far. Looking back, I think that's what was happening to me. Not laziness, not weakness, not lack of character, friction. A growing gap between who I was and who I thought I needed to be. And for a while, I managed the friction reasonably well, until life introduced a much more powerful lesson. One that would take all of those tendencies and amplify them dramatically. Because eventually, I entered a relationship where shrinking stopped becoming an occasional adaptation and became a way of life. And again, I want to tread carefully here. Not because it wasn't significant, it was, but because I don't think every story needs to become a courtroom. I don't need to prove anything, I don't need to convince anyone, and I don't need to walk through every detail for the shape to be visible. So let's just say this. For a long time, I was in a deeply unhealthy relationship. And for a long time, I didn't fully realize how unhealthy it was. Because when you've already spent years learning to adjust yourself for connection, years learning how to monitor the room, years learning to prioritize other people's comfort over your own honesty, certain patterns can feel strangely familiar. Not healthy, familiar. There's a difference. The world gradually became smaller. Friendships became more difficult. Family became more distant. Confidence became thinner. Trust became thinner. My sense of what was reasonable, what was allowed, what was mine to decide, all of that became harder to feel clearly. And perhaps the clearest sign that something was wrong isn't that you're unhappy. It's that your world keeps getting smaller while you're somehow made to feel responsible for the walls moving inward. I became increasingly self-conscious, especially socially, especially in public, especially in situations where I might accidentally draw attention to myself, or say the wrong thing, or create the wrong reaction, or trigger the next difficult conversation. So I started avoiding, not dramatically, quietly. The way a shoreline disappears one tide at a time. I avoided situations, avoided people, avoided opportunities, avoided visibility, avoided versions of myself that felt risky. And eventually, I became almost invisible. Not physically, I was still there, still showing up, still doing life, still participating. But I wasn't really expressing myself. I was managing, monitoring, reflecting, performing, trying to become whatever version of myself would create the least friction. And that takes an extraordinary amount of energy, which is perhaps why so many people don't realize they're doing it. They're too busy surviving it. There was a period when my anxiety became severe enough that I barely left the house. I was off work for years. Years. And when I say that now, it sounds enormous. But at the time, it simply became normal. Small life, contained life, a reduced world. And yes, during that period, I sometimes used alcohol as a crutch. Not in a dramatic movie sense. Not because I was an alcoholic, but because alcohol is something many people recognize. It briefly lowers the volume. The self-consciousness, the hyper-awareness, the tension, the endless monitoring. For a few hours, things became easier. You became easier. And I understand why that version of me reached for it. I really do. He was trying to regulate a nervous system he didn't yet understand. Trying to create relief with the tools he had available. But eventually, something became impossible to ignore. A truth that I had spent years negotiating around. There is a phrase that comes back to me whenever I think about that period. A feeling more than a sentence. But if I had to translate it, it would be this. There's none of me left. Not literally, obviously. I was still there, somewhere. But every year seemed to require another compromise, another adjustment, another reduction, another piece set aside in the name of keeping things working. Until eventually, I realized the strategy itself had failed. The bargain underneath it all had failed. Because the promise had always been something like, if I shrink enough, I'll be safe. If I become manageable enough, I'll be loved. If I adapt enough, everything will settle down. But it never settles. Because there is no finish line to self-erasure. There is always one more piece to surrender. And I think that was the moment the box became a cage. Not because the box was evil, not because adaptation was wrong, but because the strategy that once helped me survive was now preventing me from living. And something inside me finally noticed. Something that had been quiet for a very long time. Anger. Not rage, not revenge, not destruction. A different kind of anger. The kind that says no. The kind that says, this isn't enough. This isn't love. This isn't the life I came to live. And I think anger gets misunderstood sometimes. Because yes, it can be disruptive. But sometimes anger is simply grief standing up. Sometimes it's the first part of you that remembers you're allowed to exist. And once that voice woke up, the old arrangement could never quite fit the same way again. Not because I suddenly knew what to do. I didn't. Not because I suddenly became more confident. I wasn't. But because a tiny part of me had become willing to risk the unknown. Because the known had become too small to breathe inside. And looking back now, I think that's one of the most important thresholds in my life. Not when everything got better, not when everything changed, but when some forgotten part of me remembered that survival and living are not the same thing. And shortly after that, another possibility entered the picture. Not a rescue, not a solution, not an ending, a different kind of beginning. And once more, I want to be careful here. Because I think we sometimes tell stories about love in a way that accidentally gives away our power. As though another person arrives and fixes us, completes us, saves us, heals us. That isn't my story, and I don't think it's a particularly healthy story either. Melanie didn't save me. She didn't arrive carrying a magic key. She didn't unlock the cage and lead a fully healed version of me into a perfect future, which is probably for the best. I suspect we both would have found that unbearably embarrassing. What she did do was something much quieter and something much more important. She became evidence. Evidence that connection did not have to feel like containment. Evidence that being loved did not require me to become smaller. Evidence that another way of relating might actually exist. And I don't think I realized how much I needed that. Because for years, I'd been searching for something that felt like home. In identities, in relationships, friendships, communities, in music, books, and films, in whatever mirror happened to reflect something familiar back at me. And sometimes those things helped. Sometimes they genuinely did. But they were often shelters, not homes. With Melanie, something felt different. Not perfect, not simple, not free of challenge, just different. Safer, more mutual, more spacious. I didn't feel the same pressure to constantly edit myself, to calculate every word, to anticipate every consequence, to negotiate for permission to exist. And that mattered more than I understood at the time. Because once you've experienced even a small amount of genuine safety, the counterfeit versions become much harder to tolerate. Once your nervous system receives a new piece of information, it cannot completely unknow it. And I think that's what changed. Not that I suddenly became healthy or confident or healed. Far from it. I was carrying years of fear, years of self-doubt, years of old habits, years of trying to earn certainty before allowing myself to relax. Leaving the cage didn't instantly teach me how to live in open space. Sometimes freedom is frightening. Sometimes freedom feels less like flying and more like standing outside in the cold, holding a carrier bag full of your belongings, wondering what happens next. But the contrast was there, and contrast can be incredibly powerful because once you've experienced a relationship that allows more of you to exist, you start noticing all the places where you've been surviving instead of living. And I think that's what real safety does. What love does. It doesn't finish the work. It makes the work feel possible. It doesn't heal us directly. It creates the conditions in which healing can begin. It gives the system a new reference point, a new answer to the question, what if I don't have to disappear in order to belong? And that question changed everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Because for the first time in a very long time, more of me started moving in the same direction. Not all of me, not yet, but enough. Enough to take the next step. Enough to begin building a life rather than merely surviving one. Enough to discover that the box I'd spent years living inside wasn't the only shape available. And that's important, because leaving the cage was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a much more difficult lesson. How do you live life when you're no longer shrinking? Because eventually life expanded again. Work, family, responsibility, parenthood, all the beautiful chaos that comes with trying to build something meaningful. And that's when another voice entered the conversation. Not from a relationship this time, not from another person, from my body. And unlike me, it had become completely unwilling to negotiate. For years, I'd relied on a very simple strategy. Push through. Tired? Push through. Anxious? Push through. Overwhelmed? Push through. Confused? Push through. Running on fumes? Excellent. Push through harder. And for a surprisingly long time, that strategy appeared to work. Or at least it appeared to work from the outside. Which is not always the same thing. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that functioning and flourishing are not interchangeable. You can function for a very long time while paying a cost you don't yet understand. And looking back now, I think that's exactly what happened. I was spending energy I didn't know I was spending, managing environments, managing expectations, managing relationships, managing myself. 1,000 tiny acts of adaptation, 1,000 tiny negotiations, 1,000 tiny frictions. And because I'd become so used to it, I didn't even realize it was happening. It was just life, just normal, just what everyone else seemed to be doing. Only apparently with considerably more success. Then swine flu arrived in 2009. And I want to be careful yet again here, because I'm not trying to explain anyone else's experience. I'm not presenting a theory. I'm not claiming a universal truth. I'm talking about my life, my body, my experience. And from where I stand, it felt like a system that had already been stretched thin finally crossed a threshold. Before that, I could genuinely push and recover. Maybe not elegantly, maybe not wisely, but I could recover. After that, something changed. The recovery never fully came back in the same way. And for a long time, I thought that. Because that's what I knew. Push harder, try harder, be tougher, be more disciplined, be more determined. But eventually, I ran into a problem. The body doesn't care about motivational speeches. It doesn't care about productivity culture. It doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care how important you think the thing is. Which, I must admit, felt deeply unreasonable at the time. But the message became impossible to ignore. The strategy itself was failing. And that was frightening. Because when your identity is built around adaptation, around endurance, about quietly carrying things, losing the ability to keep doing that can feel like losing yourself. But looking back now, I don't think I was losing myself. I think I was losing a survival strategy. A very old one, a very expensive one. And in its place, the body was trying to teach me something I'd spent decades avoiding. Limits. Not punishment, not weakness, not failure. Limits. The difference again matters. Because a limit is information. A limit is reality speaking. It is the system saying, this far, not further. And slowly, very slowly, I began learning a language I'd never really spoken before. The language of rhythm, capacity, recovery, pacing. Not mastery, not optimization, and certainly not biohacking my way to enlightenment. Just listening. And that sounds much more graceful than it actually was. Because mostly it looked like getting things wrong, overdoing it, crashing, learning, repeating, getting it wrong over and over again. Like a toddler repeatedly discovering that gravity remains committed to the bit. But something important was changing, perhaps for the first time in my life. The body was no longer being treated like an obstacle. It was becoming part of the conversation. And once that happened, something interesting emerged. Because the same lesson kept appearing everywhere. The lesson wasn't do less. It wasn't be smaller. It absolutely wasn't give up. The lesson was simply stop fighting yourself. Because every time I ignored my capacity, I paid for it. Every time I overrode the signal, the louder it became. Every time I treated the body as an inconvenience, the deeper the ache and exhaustion set in. And the smaller my world shrunk. Slowly, I began realizing that much of my life had followed the same pattern. Not just physically, emotionally, socially, psychologically. Different parts of me pulling in different directions. Different needs competing for attention. Different voices arguing over the controls. Friction, again. And this is where the story begins to get interesting. Because while I was busy learning how to listen to my body, another mirror was quietly approaching. A mirror that would completely reorganize my understanding of almost everything that had come before. And as is often the way with these things, It arrived disguised as my children, which I think is one of the great tricks life plays on us. You spend years trying to understand yourself, and then someone hands you a tiny human and says, "Good luck. Also, here's a mirror." Because for a long time, I thought I was helping my children understand themselves. And hopefully, occasionally I was. But in the process, they were helping me understand myself too. Especially during lockdown, when the world slowed down, when the usual routines were disrupted, when school, social expectations, and all the normal structures temporarily loosened their grip. I found myself watching my children differently, not analysing them, not diagnosing them, just noticing. Noticing what energized them, what overwhelmed them, what brought them alive, what exhausted them, what happened when they were allowed to exist in rhythms that felt more natural to them. And while I was watching them, something unexpected started happening. I began remembering myself. Not new memories, old memories, memories I'd carried for decades. But suddenly, they were arriving with context attached. The collections, the obsessions, the need for structure, the fascination with systems. The way certain changes felt bigger than they seemed to other people. I remembered crying at the start of school terms, not because I didn't want to learn. I loved learning, because the transition itself felt overwhelming. The sudden shift, the unfamiliarity, the disruption of a rhythm I'd finally settled into. I remembered a birthday party where I discovered, upon arrival, that it was actually a pool party. And that probably sounds like a tiny thing, a slightly amusing childhood memory. But I can still feel it. The shock, the internal collapse, the sense that the world I'd prepared for had vanished and been replaced by a different one without warning. I was offered a spare swimsuit, a perfectly reasonable solution, but I couldn't do it. Not because I was being difficult, not because I was being dramatic. The whole situation had changed too quickly, and I didn't know how to enter that new version of reality. So I sat there, waiting, awkwardly, for the day to end. And memory after memory started lining up like that. Not as excuses, not as evidence, as context. And eventually, I reached a point where I could no longer avoid a possibility I'd been circling for years. Maybe I wasn't broken. Maybe I wasn't lazy. Maybe I wasn't failing at being normal. Maybe I'd been reading the wrong manual. And again, I want to be careful here, because labels can be useful, but they can also be limiting, sometimes both simultaneously. But when I began exploring autism, something clicked. Not all at once, not dramatically, just clicked. Like a camera lens finally finding focus. Suddenly, the child under the table made more sense. The collections made more sense. The exhaustion made more sense. The misunderstandings made more sense. The feeling that ordinary life seemed to cost more than advertised made more sense. And then came one of the strangest parts of the whole experience: telling people. Or more specifically, writing a Facebook post, which, as life-changing spiritual thresholds go, lacks a certain grandeur. No mountains, no sacred caves, no ancient prophecies. Just me, staring at a button for an absurd amount of time. Rewriting the same post over and over again, reading it, editing it, rereading it, until the words stopped looking like language and started looking like evidence in a court case I wasn't entirely convinced I wanted to attend. Because I was terrified. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified of being dismissed. Terrified of being judged. Terrified that people would somehow think less of me. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because even after all that work, the box was still trying to protect me. Still whispering, careful, don't stand out, don't give people a reason. But eventually, I did post it. And something surprising happened. The sky didn't fall. The world carried on. The response was limited but kind. Some absences were noticeable. Some comments were deeply touching. And underneath all the noise, what I felt most was relief. Not because a label fixed anything. It didn't. But because a hidden part of me was hidden no longer. Autistic Paul came home. And when that happened, something arrived right behind him. Because once one lens clicks into place, you start seeing the rest of the picture. And eventually, another pattern became impossible to ignore. The speed, the restlessness, the novelty seeking, the creativity, the endless associations, the tendency to discover 17 new interests before lunch. And suddenly, there was another lens, another piece of the puzzle, another explanation for things I'd spent years trying to understand. And if autism helped me understand the structure, ADHD helped me to understand the movement. One explained why I needed rhythm. The other explained why I kept trying to dance away from it. One explained why I loved certainty. The other explained why I kept chasing novelty. And together, they revealed something fascinating. The story wasn't about choosing one side. It wasn't about finding the correct identity. It wasn't about replacing one box with another. The story was about understanding the whole system. And once those lenses arrived, the entire past began rearranging itself, not into a different life, into a more coherent one. For the first time, I wasn't looking at disconnected chapters. I was looking at a single story, a story that finally made sense. And once that happened, the aperture opened. Because understanding yourself changes the way you pay attention. And changing the way you pay attention changes everything. Now, I know that sounds suspiciously mystical, like I'm about to disappear into the woods and start talking to trees, which, for the record, is an entirely separate episode. But what I mean is actually much simpler. My attention changed. For years, I've been looking at my life through a lens of confusion, trying to work out what was wrong, why things felt harder than they seemed for other people, why I could be capable in one situation and completely overwhelmed in another. And then suddenly, many of the pieces started fitting together. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough. And once you stop spending quite so much energy fighting yourself, something interesting happens. You have more energy available for everything else. For curiosity, for creativity, for relationships, for attention, for participation. And that's when things started moving quickly. Ideas connected, patterns emerged, writing poured out. Models appeared. Connections between seemingly unrelated things started revealing themselves everywhere. And honestly, it was exhilarating. For a while, it felt as though someone had opened a window in a world I'd been living in for decades. Fresh air, fresh perspective, fresh possibility. And I understand why people sometimes describe experiences like that in spiritual language. Awakening, downloads, revelation, connection, flow. Because when a new level of coherence arrives, it can feel like you're receiving information from somewhere else. But my experience was always a little simpler and a little stranger. It felt less like receiving answers and more like noticing relationships, patterns, connections, resonances, the way one idea quietly illuminates another, the way a conversation from 10 years ago suddenly makes sense in light of something you learned yesterday. And for a while, I wanted to capture all of it. Every insight, every model, every possibility, every connection. My notes apps became increasingly concerned for my well-being. And I understand that impulse now. Because after years of compression, expansion feels incredible. The problem is that expansion and integration are not the same thing. And that became one of the biggest lessons of my life. Not every insight needs to become a project. Not every idea needs to become a philosophy. Not every pattern needs to become a map. Sometimes an insight arrives simply to change the way you see it. And this is where I started recognizing something that had been present throughout the entire story. The same thing that showed up after the divorce, showed up in the relationship, through illness and through neurodivergence, friction, or perhaps more accurately, the reduction of friction. Because every major turning point in my life seemed to involve the same movement. Not becoming someone new, becoming someone less divided. The child who loved certainty, the adult who wanted freedom, the part that wanted safety, adventure, to belong, to be honest. For years, they had all been pulling in different directions. And the result wasn't failure. It was drag. Like driving with the handbrake half on and wondering why the journey feels so difficult. And little by little, that started changing. Not because all the parts suddenly agreed. They still don't. I assure you, they still don't. But because they started talking to one another. The child got a voice. The exhausted one got a voice. The autistic one, the ADHD one, the frightened one, the hopeful one. They all got a voice. And when all parts feel heard, they often stop shouting. That's a lesson I'm still learning. At home, at work, in relationships, in creativity, in every part of life. Because alignment isn't perfection. Alignment isn't certainty. Alignment isn't never being conflicted again. Alignment is cooperation. It's more of you moving in the same direction, more of you trusting the same step, more of you participating in the same life. And I think that's why some of my most expansive moments have felt the way they have. Not because I transcended myself, not because I escaped myself, because for a few moments, more of me arrived at the same place at the same time. And that feels extraordinary, not because it's supernatural, because it's rare. Which brings me, finally, to the lesson underneath all of this. The lesson I wish I'd understood much earlier. The goal was never to become a better box. The goal was to stop living inside one. And I think that's the biggest thing I've learned from everything we've talked about today. Not that I was broken. Not that I was secretly a different person all along. Not that one diagnosis, one insight, one relationship, or one revelation suddenly explained everything. The lesson was simpler than that. And harder. Most of my life, I thought growth meant becoming someone else. A better version, a stronger version, a more confident version, a more successful version. A version who finally got everything right. But looking back now, I don't think that's what happened at all. What happened was that more and more of me became welcome. The child who hid under tables. The teenager trying desperately to fit in. The anxious, vulnerable young man. The exhausted adult. The late to the party neurodivergent. The frustrated, advocating parent. The angry one. The deeply loving one. The one who wants to understand everything, but who also occasionally wants everyone to stop talking for 10 minutes. All of them. Not because every part should be in charge. Not because every impulse should be followed. Not because authenticity means turning every passing feeling into a lifestyle choice. But because every part contains information. Every part is carrying something. Every part formed for a reason. And I've come to believe that much of the suffering we experience comes from treating parts of ourselves as enemies, trying to exile them, suppress them, pretending they aren't there. Because the strange thing is, the parts we reject rarely disappear. They just find other ways to speak. Through anxiety, exhaustion, resentment, through procrastination and paralysis, through that nagging sense that something isn't quite right. And for years, I thought the answer was discipline, or certainty, or understanding, or finding the correct identity. Now I think the answer is closer to relationship. Listening, curiosity, compassion. Creating enough safety inside yourself that fewer parts need to fight for airtime. And maybe that's what alignment really is. Not perfection, not agreement, not the end of conflict. Cooperation. An inner household learning how to live together. Some parts are still frightened. Some are still grieving. Some are still trying to protect old wounds. Some are still convinced they know exactly what we should be doing next. And occasionally they still hold meetings without my permission. But the difference now is that they're part of the conversation. They're no longer locked outside. And that changes everything. Because when fewer parts of you are fighting each other, more energy becomes available for living, for creating, for connecting, for exploring, for participating, for becoming. Not someone else, just more yourself. And that's why I no longer think authenticity is about stripping everything away until some pure, original self remains. I think authenticity is closer to inclusion, to making room for contradictions, making room for complexity, for old versions of yourself that still have something useful to say, making room for the frightened child, for the tired adult, for the joyful explorer within us all, for the parts that don't yet know how to belong. Because belonging, I've discovered, isn't something we only find in other people. Sometimes it's something we create inside ourselves. And every now and then, when I think about all of this, my mind drifts back to that little boy sitting under the table, overwhelmed, unsure, waiting for the world to feel safe enough to step into. And what moves me now isn't that he was hiding. It's that somebody came and sat beside him. Nobody forced him out. Nobody demanded he be different. Nobody told him to hurry up. They simply met him where he was. And maybe that's the deepest lesson in this whole story. Because I spent years trying to become someone worthy of acceptance, when what I actually needed was to learn how to sit beside the parts of myself that already existed. All the awkward and misunderstood ones. To stop demanding they justify their existence and simply say, I see you. You can come out when you're ready. And maybe that's the invitation I'd leave you with today. Not don't shrink for anyone, but something gentler, something more practical. Where in your life have you become smaller than is necessary? Not where have you adapted. Adaptation can be wise. Not where have you worn a mask. Masks can be useful. Not where have you survived. Survival deserves respect. But where has the old shape become too tight? Where are you still performing safety instead of feeling it? Where are you still carrying a version of yourself that was built for a world that no longer exists? And what might happen if you made just a little more room? Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for one more honest conversation, one more boundary, one more truth, one more forgotten part of yourself to come home. Because I don't think the goal is to destroy the box. The box helped. The box protected. The box got us here. I think the goal is simply to grow beyond it. To build something larger around it. A life with doors and windows and room to move. A life that doesn't require your disappearance in order to function. A life where more of you is allowed to participate. And if that happens, even a little, you may discover what I've been slowly discovering myself. That freedom isn't becoming someone new. It's finally having enough space to be who you already were. Thanks for listening. I've been Paul. This has been Accidental Transcendental. Stay curious, stay humble, and never stop asking why. See you next time.